What the PMOS name change reveals about women's health. Welcome back to Sipping on Wellness. Over the past several episodes, we've been talking about metabolism, hormones, stress, inflammation, and how the body systems work together. And while preparing for today's episode, I came across a story that immediately caught my attention. Not because it introduced a brand new condition, not because the science suddenly changed overnight, but because it highlighted something many women have been experiencing for years. You may have seen the headlines recently about PCOS, Polycystic Ovary Syndrome, and a proposed effort to rename it PMOS, or Polyendocrine Metabolic Ovarian Syndrome. Now, on the surface, that may not seem like a big deal. Medical conditions get renamed from time to time. Most of us don't pay much attention. But the more I read about it, the more I realized the most interesting part isn't the new name. It's what the old name may have caused us to miss. Because when most people hear PCOS, they think about ovaries. They think about irregular periods, fertility struggles, cysts, and reproductive systems. And while those things certainly matter, many women have been experiencing something much broader. They may be struggling with energy, dealing with weight loss resistance, noticing more cravings, experiencing brain fog, or facing symptoms that don't always seem connected at first glance. In fact, if you've ever found yourself thinking, I know something feels off, but I can't quite put all the pieces together, you're not alone. For years, many women have been trying to solve what look like separate problems, only to discover those problems may have been related all along. And that's what makes this conversation so fascinating, because this isn't really an episode about a name change. It's an episode about what happens when we stop looking at one symptom, one organ, or one diagnosis, and start looking at the bigger picture. Before we go any further, a quick reminder, I'm not your doctor, and this podcast isn't intended to diagnose, treat, or replace individualized medical care. My goal is to share research, education, and practical insights to help you better understand your health and ask informed questions. As always, before making any changes to your nutrition, supplements, medications, or healthcare plan, please consult with a qualified healthcare provider or practitioner who knows your individual situation. Today, we're exploring what this proposed shift from PCOS to PMOS reveals about women's health and why understanding the whole picture often changes everything. As I was reading about this proposed name change, I kept coming back to one thought. I wonder how many women have spent years trying to solve what looked like a separate problem. Maybe one woman is frustrated because her periods have become irregular. Another is struggling with stubborn weight gain. Someone else can't figure out why she's exhausted every afternoon, even though she's trying to eat well and take care of herself. On the surface, those seem like completely different conversations. And after a long time, that's exactly how many of them were treated. But when you've worked with enough women, you start to notice something. The symptoms may be different, but the experience often sounds surprisingly similar. A woman will tell me, I just don't feel like myself anymore. She's not necessarily looking for a diagnosis. She's looking for an explanation. She's trying to understand why her energy has changed, why her cravings feel different, why her body isn't responding the way it used to, or why symptoms seem to be showing up in multiple places at once. And that's why this conversation around PCOS and PMOS is so interesting to me, because it challenges the idea that we should only focus on one symptom or one body system at a time. What if the irregular cycles, fatigue, cravings, weight gain, and brain fog aren't separate problems? What if they're different pieces of the same puzzle? The longer we study women's health, the more we realize those symptoms may be connected in ways we didn't fully appreciate before. And sometimes the symptom that gets our attention isn't actually where things started. It's simply the thing that finally gets us to pay attention. The longer I've thought about this, the more I've become convinced that the name isn't the story. What matters is what the name change reveals, because names influence where we look. If I tell you a condition is primarily about the ovaries, you're naturally going to focus on reproductive systems. If I tell you the condition may involve hormones, metabolism, cardiovascular health, inflammation, and other endocrine systems, suddenly the conversation becomes much bigger. And I think that's what we're seeing happen. For years, Many women were told they had a hormone problem. And while that's not wrong, it may not be the whole picture. Others were told they needed to lose weight. Others focused entirely on fertility. Others were trying to manage symptoms like acne, fatigue, cravings, or irregular cycles. Everyone was looking at a different piece of the puzzle. What we're beginning to recognize is that the puzzle may have been bigger than we realized. Instead of asking, how do we manage this symptom, we're starting to ask, what is happening within the larger system? That's a really different question. Once you step back, you realize these systems don't operate independently. Hormones influence metabolism. Stress influences hormones. Metabolism influences energy. What happens in one area often affects another. That's where this conversation becomes relevant for all of us, because the more we understand those relationships, the less likely we are to get stuck chasing symptoms one at a time. And the more likely we are to start asking better questions about what's happening underneath them. Even if you've never been diagnosed with PCOS, I think there's something valuable we can take away from this conversation, because at its core, this really isn't a discussion about a diagnosis. It's a discussion about how we think about our health. One of the things I've noticed over the years is how easy it is to become focused on the symptom that's bothering us the most. And that's understandable. If you're exhausted, you want more energy. If you're struggling with your weight, you want to lose weight. If you're dealing with digestive issues, you want your digestion to improve. We naturally focus on the thing that's creating the most frustration, but sometimes that focus can cause us to miss the bigger picture. I've had women come to me wanting help with hormones, only to discover that stress and blood sugar were playing a much bigger role than they realized. I've had women come because they wanted to lose weight, only to find that poor sleep and chronic stress were making that goal much harder than it needed to be. I've had women focused on digestive systems who eventually realized that what was happening in their gut was affecting much more than their digestion. That's often when people begin noticing a pattern they haven't seen before. And I think that's one of the most valuable lessons from this PMOS conversation. The system that gets your attention isn't always the place to start. Sometimes it's simply the clue that tells you it's time to ask a better question. Not how do I get rid of this symptom, but what might my body be trying to tell me? Because that question often leads to a much more meaningful answer. As I dove deeper into this episode, I couldn't help but notice how similar this conversation is to the way we often see ourselves. It's easy to focus on the thing that's bothering us most, the diagnosis, the symptom, the struggle, the thing that isn't working the way we want it to. Over time, that one thing can begin to take up so much space that it becomes the primary lens through which we see ourselves. But God has always seen a much bigger picture. In Psalm 139, David writes, "You have searched me, Lord, and you know me." I love that verse because it reminds us that God doesn't know us in pieces. He doesn't know us as a collection of symptoms, lab results, diagnoses, or health frustrations. He knows us completely. And unlike us, He never loses sight of the whole picture. I think that's one of the reasons Jesus' interactions with people in Scripture are so powerful. When others saw a problem, Jesus saw a person. When others saw a label, Jesus saw a life. When others focused as one part of someone's experience, Jesus understood there was always more to consider. And maybe that's something we need to remember too. Your diagnosis is not your identity. Your symptoms are not your identity. Your health challenges are not your identity. They may be part of your experience, but they are not the whole picture. Because long before anyone gave you a diagnosis, God knew your name. Long before anyone identified a symptom, God knew your heart. And long before anyone understood what was happening in your body, God understood you completely. While medicine continues learning how interconnected the body truly is, God has always seen the whole person. And I find a lot of comfort in that. As we wrap up today's conversation, I hope you'll remember that the most important part of this discussion isn't the proposed name change. It's what the conversation reveals. Sometimes the symptom that gets our attention isn't actually the place where things begin. It's simply the clue that invites us to look deeper. If today's episode resonated with you, I've created a series of free What I'd Start With guides. Walk through the foundational steps I would consider before jumping into advanced hormone testing, gut testing, or the next thing you saw on social media. They're designed to help you understand where to start, what questions to ask, and how to think about your health through a whole body lens. I've also linked my Fullscript storefront in the show notes, where you'll find the supplement brands and foundational products I personally trust and recommend. You can find all of those resources in the show notes. So until next time, friend, stay nourished, stay steady, and choose wellness, one thoughtful step at a time.